Brookfield Police! You go one way, I got the other. Another one on the left. The RP said there was a stalker.
On the morning of December 14th, 2023, Crystal Krug sent a text message to her husband. She asked him to pick up their daughter after school. She mentioned a meeting with a detective. It was a routine message, the kind anyone might send on a busy morning. 20 minutes later, she was gone. By the time police found her on the garage floor, unconscious, with a head wound and a stab injury, the question was no longer just who did this. The question was how long this had been coming, and whether anyone could have seen it. What investigators would eventually uncover wasn't just a murder. It was a carefully constructed illusion, one that Crystal herself had spent months trying to expose. And in the end, it was her own meticulous documentation that brought the truth to light. Crystal Krug was 44 years old, a chemical engineer by training, a mother of 3, and by every account, a woman of sharp intelligence and careful precision. She lived in Broomfield, Colorado, with her husband, Dan Krug, and their children. To those who knew her, she was organized, devoted, and fiercely protective of her family. But in the final months of her life, Crystal was living under a shadow that most people couldn't see. Beginning in late September 2023, a series of disturbing events began unfolding, and Crystal, true to her nature, started documenting every single one of them. On September 23rd, Dan Krug returned home to find a stranger fleeing the property. The intruder had jumped the gate and disappeared down the street. A spare house key was missing from the garage toolbox. Police were called, a search was conducted, and nothing was found. Crystal was more irritated than alarmed at that point. She suspected Dan had simply left the garage door open, but she noted it anyway. Days later, on October 2nd, Crystal received a message from an unknown number. It read, "Hey Crystal, it's Anthony. I hope it's okay that I found you." The name triggered a memory. The only Anthony she had ever known was Jack Anthony Holland, a man she had briefly dated in the summer of 1999, right after high school graduation. Their relationship had lasted less than a year. Crystal was heading to college, pursuing an engineering degree. Anthony was on a different path entirely. She ended things amicably. Over the following years, he had occasionally resurfaced on social media, sending messages, suggesting they reconnect, declaring they were meant to be together. Each time, Crystal had shut it down. She had gotten married in 2007, started a family, and eventually left Facebook altogether. As far as she was concerned, that chapter was closed. The message on October 2nd didn't alarm her immediately, but the one that followed the very next day did. "You should have said yes when I asked. I've seen your photos. You've put on weight. I bet your loser husband doesn't even want anything to do with you anymore." This was different. This was hostile. Crystal had never known Anthony to speak this way. Something had changed in him, and she could feel it. What followed over the next several weeks was a sustained campaign of harassment. Explicit messages flooded in from unknown numbers. Crystal later discovered that someone had posted her name and phone number online, inviting men to contact her.
My wife isn't responding to text messages or phone calls.
Okay.
We've had threats against us. Can I get maybe a wellness check at the house? We have both been targeted by a stalker.
It was designed to humiliate, to destabilize, and it was working. Then, on October 31st, an email arrived from an address bearing the name, a.holland.kicks. It contained a photograph of Dan Krug, taken outside his workplace, without his knowledge. The message that accompanied it was unambiguous. He better be careful driving. Wouldn't want to see a clear hose in his exhaust pipe. This was no longer harassment. This was a threat against her husband's life. Crystal went to the Broomfield Police Department and reported everything. She didn't arrive empty-handed. She brought a detailed spreadsheet, a stalker log she had been building since the first incident. Every date, every message, every location, her feelings, her fears, the pattern she had noticed. It was meticulous, precise, and devastating to read. Detective Martinez, assigned to the case, later recalled that Crystal walked into that room and filled it with her presence. She was prepared in a way that few victims ever are. The detective arranged for undercover officers to monitor the area around the Krug home, checked Crystal's vehicle for tracking devices, and issued search warrants to Verizon, TextNow, and Google in order to trace the origin of the messages. The problem was that these responses would take weeks, sometimes months. In the meantime, all they could do was watch and wait. Meanwhile, Crystal's fear continued to deepen. Messages arrived claiming the sender had seen her at the dentist. Another stated plainly, "I'll get rid of him, and then we'll be together." Dan was the target. Her children were in the same house. Crystal began carrying a 9mm handgun in a concealed carry purse, took her daughter to the gun range, and sat in the parking lot and wept. She told her parents her marriage was deteriorating. She and Dan were arguing constantly, overwhelmed by the strain. Her eldest daughter said she had been more frightened by the hushed conversations at home than by anything said aloud. So Crystal told her children the truth, as gently as she could, and made sure they knew what to do if something happened. Because of the stalker's unknown whereabouts, Crystal was asked not to attend her daughter's performances in the Nutcracker that Christmas season. She had spent years backstage at those shows, helping the young dancers prepare, calling them out on cue. Being excluded from that felt like another theft, another piece of her life taken away. She told Detective Martinez, "My fear is, when does the switch happen? When does he suddenly get emboldened because I'm not responding?" The surveillance cameras installed around the Krug home recorded the morning in careful detail. At 6:45, Dan drove their oldest daughter to the bus stop and returned before 7 o'clock. At 7:42, Crystal left to take the two younger children to school, returning just before 8 o'clock. At 8:24, Dan left for work, a 30-minute commute. At 8:56, Dan received a text from Crystal asking him to pick up their daughter after school. She mentioned a meeting with Detective Martinez. 20 minutes later, Dan arrived at the office and replied, asking Crystal to put the chicken back in the refrigerator. She never responded. For the next 3 hours, Dan called her repeatedly. No answer. At 12:01 in the afternoon, he contacted the Broomfield Police Department and requested a welfare check. Officer O'Hara arrived at the house and walked the perimeter. The garage door windows were positioned too high to see through from the ground. He retrieved his car, pulled it close to the door, climbed up, and looked inside. Crystal Krug was on the garage floor, unconscious, bleeding from a head wound. Paramedics were called immediately. The initial thought was that she had fallen. That possibility was erased almost immediately. She had been struck in the head. She had also been stabbed. The attack had occurred near her car, either as she was getting in or stepping out. Crystal Krug was pronounced dead at the scene. Her mother, Linda Krug, arrived just as the garage door was being opened for the paramedics. She heard the words, "That's my daughter," and understood at once. When Dan arrived minutes later, he collapsed. His legs gave out. The people around him reached out to hold him up.
I arrived at the police department and immediately went to go speak with Dan. When I walked in, he became very emotional.
I know
I didn't protect her.
it's not your fault.
Trying to make things a little easier, Detective Martinez tells Dan Krug that there are people on her team who can help break the news to their children.
With Crystal's murder now the focus of a full criminal investigation, detectives moved quickly toward the most obvious lead. Jack Anthony Holland, the ex-boyfriend Crystal, had been trying to serve with a restraining order for months. They traced a vehicle registered in his name to a residence in north-central Utah, coordinated with local authorities, and moved in. Holland answered the door calmly, invited them inside, and cooperated without hesitation. When asked about Crystal, he acknowledged knowing her, said she was his very first girlfriend, that the breakup had been painful for both of them, and that he had reached out one final time in 2016 to apologize before letting it go. He also had an alibi. On the morning of December 14th, Anthony Holland had been shopping at a clothing store in American Fork, Utah, approximately 500 miles from Broomfield, Colorado. He produced a purchase receipt. Investigators verified the date, time, and transaction location. The data confirmed his account. Anthony Holland was not in Colorado when Crystal Krug was murdered. There were no legal grounds to hold him. For Detective Martinez, who had spent months building a case around the assumption that Holland was the stalker, this was a moment of profound recalibration. I felt like I was looking at the wrong person the whole time. And then the data began arriving. The search warrants served to Verizon, TextNow, and Google had finally begun producing results. As investigators reviewed the technical metadata behind the stalking messages, a pattern emerged, one that was not pointing toward Utah, or toward a stranger who had broken into the garage months earlier. It was pointing toward Dan Krug's office. The IP addresses tied to the threatening messages, the email accounts, the burner phone activity, all of it traced back to Wi-Fi networks at Dan's workplace. Investigators dug further. The burner phone used to send the very first messages had been purchased at a store in Broomfield, paid for with a gift card registered in Dan Krug's name. There was more. The final text message Crystal had supposedly sent Dan at 8:56 that morning, the one asking him to pick up their daughter, had not been sent in real time. It had been scheduled in advance, composed before Dan even left the house. It was part of a constructed alibi, a message sent from Crystal's phone to give the appearance that she was alive after he had already departed. Investigators reviewed footage from Dan's workplace cameras. He had moved through the building in specific patterns, along routes that placed him in front of cameras at precisely timed intervals, as if ensuring a visual record of his presence. He had also called Crystal's phone repeatedly throughout the morning, then contacted police to request a welfare check himself, careful never to be the one who discovered the body. The evidence was assembling itself into a single, coherent picture. Dan Krug had spent months staging the stalking campaign. He had created the threatening messages, the fake email accounts, the explicit posts, all designed to make Crystal believe her ex-boyfriend had become dangerous. All designed to give himself an undetectable motive and an outside suspect. And when it became clear that Crystal was getting closer to the truth, that her meeting with Detective Martinez might expose him, he killed her. After the murder, he drove to work, walked the same camera-visible routes, received the scheduled text message he had set up himself, and called the police. Dan Krug was arrested as he was driving to watch his daughter perform in the Nutcracker. He was pulled over without warning. During the trial, additional testimony emerged from another woman who described receiving deeply threatening and harassing messages, traced back, through the same technical process, to a college Dan Krug had attended on the East Coast. The pattern was not new. It was practiced. In the weeks before Crystal's death, her own family had quietly begun to question whether Dan was involved. Her mother, Linda, had felt something she couldn't name. Crystal's stepmother later told investigators that Crystal herself had said, in her final days, that she could no longer rule Dan out. She had been circling the truth, and he had known it. After 7 days of testimony, the jury deliberated and returned a verdict. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Guilty of stalking. Guilty of criminal impersonation. On sentencing day, the judge handed down life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dan Krug had believed his plan was airtight. He had constructed it carefully. The false identity, the months of manufactured fear, the alibi built into Crystal's own phone. He had believed that no one would look past the obvious suspect, and that Crystal would never be believed over him. He underestimated her. Crystal Krug had documented everything. Every message, every date, every location, every feeling. She had created a record so detailed and complete that when investigators finally had the digital data to compare it against, the pieces locked into place with a precision that Dan had never anticipated. The very thoroughness that defined her in life became the instrument of his undoing. She never learned who the stalker really was, but she came close enough that he felt he had no choice. Crystal's 3 children now live with her parents. Her mother and father carry their grief quietly, channeling it into the daily work of raising the grandchildren their daughter left behind. They speak of Crystal often, in photographs, in routines, in the small moments that carry her presence forward. Her oldest daughter still dances. Crystal Krug was 44 years old. She was precise, determined, and deeply loved. In the end, her final act was the same as every other. She documented the truth as carefully as she could, and trusted that someone would eventually see it. Someone did.